can catch those up in your own time. But we're going to be carrying on with Orach Chaim. So we began going through the different halachot of brachot. That is the theme of this volume. Going through the Suda, going through the meal. So we spoke about the other halachot, the other brachot that we'd have to recite during a meal. We spoke about changing locations, Shinoi Makom regarding brachot. We now move towards the end of the meal. We're going to be looking at Ilchot today, Mayim Achronim, after that Zimun, Birkat HaMazon, and then going back to some of the brachot before food as well. So the truth is that this sugya of Mayim Achronim is an interesting case study, can teach us a lot of halachic principles, whereby something very, very common questions come up in many rounds, where you have a takana, you have a halacha, you have something which Chazal told us we have to do for whatever reason. And nowadays, we see that reason does not necessarily apply. When do we say that the halacha remains as it was? When do we say we have a statement like batel tam and batel takana, which means even though the reason which originally for which it was given, that reason no longer applies, but we may say that the takana still does apply. Sometimes we say yes, sometimes we say no. The truth is that it's very difficult to give a clear principle that goes throughout all the cases as to when we would say yes and no. Generally speaking, the principle is that once you have something which has been established by Chazal, even if they explain why or gave us a reason for it, very often we will say that remains, especially if it's what's called a davar shebeminyan, meaning the Sanhedrin got together and established this is the requirement, this is the practice, their practice will remain. There are certain exceptions, and there are times whereby the reason no longer applies, we say the practice no longer applies either. And we'll see, regarding Mayim Achronim, for example, we have a tremendous machloket about this in the Rishonim. Part of the reason why we have a machloket is because we have two different Gemarot, which tell us about the requirement of Mayim Achronim. Two different Gemarot, and each one gives a different reason as to what it is. So we'll see how the Rishonim understand the relation between those two Gemarot and where we are today. So, opening up on page 57. Page 57 in volume 14, we begin with the Gemara in Chulin. Source number 1. Gemara Masechet Chulin Daf Kuf Hey Amud Aleph says the following: Amar of Idi bar Avin, Amar of Yitzchak bar Ashiam, Mayim Rishonim Mitzvah, Ve'achronim Chova. So we find that the Gemara also actually talks about Mayim Tzayim in a few different places. There is the waters that you wash before the meal, the water at the end of the meal, in between, in the middle of the meal, going between meat and fish, or something like that. But it says here, Mayim Rishonim Mitzvah, Ve'achronim Chova. So the water, in order to wash before a meal, referring to where we're eating bread, where you have to have Natilat Yadayim, that is a mitzvah. Mitzvah, the implication here, mitzvah min Rabbanan. Ve'achronim Chova. But Mayim Achronim are an obligation. So the language of Chova, of obligation, seems to be more stringent even than mitzvah. So based on this, the Gemara seems to indicate that Mayim Achronim is a stronger obligation than Mayim Rishonim. And now why is that? Amar Rav Yehuda Reid Rabbi Chia Mipnei Ma Amru Mayim Achronim Chova. So why do you say that it's an obligation? Shemelach Stomit Yesh Shemesameh Et HaEnayim. Okay, this is the big question which everybody, the Shulchan Aruch, is going to bring this as well. He says the reason why we have Mayim Achronim is there was a certain type of salt in their days called Melach Stomit, which was, if you would touch it and it would get into your eyes, it would make one blind. Okay, I'm not sure how many people here, I can guess, have ever encountered Melach Stomit at their Shabbos tables. It's not something which is commonplace today. It sounds very strange to us. You're going to touch your food, even if your food has salt in, there's a danger of blindness. But that is what the Gemara says, and that's why we're going to see many of the Rishonim, Tosfot, point out we don't have Melach Stomit today anymore. If the entire reason for Mayim Achronim, washing one's hands at the end of the meal before benching, is because there is a danger. Now you notice that's why the Gemara here says it's a chova rather than a mitzvah, meaning it's more stringent because it is dangerous. We have a principle in halacha, chamira sakanta meisura. But we have something which is a danger to one's life or one's health, we have to be more stringent about that even than a prohibition. That has a number of expressions. So therefore, says the Gemara, because we're worried of this danger, we're worried about blindness, we're concerned about this melach stomit, therefore one would have to go and wash Mayim Achronim. Says Rashi, here source number 2, he points out shemelach stomit yesh, Says Rashi, why would it be that you would always have, if this melach stomit is so dangerous, so just don't have salt at the table? What's going on? He says, no, we're always meant to have salt. So it says over here, if you're going to have the salt, and then you will you'll go and your hands will touch it, they'll touch your eyes, and therefore there is this danger of blindness. The reason why salt is necessary, salt is something which is more meshubach, it's going to improve the food, right? So we dip the bread in salt, also reminiscent of the korbanot, and therefore, but that was the salt that was commonplace in their days. If you turn over the page, you've seen footnote number 2, by the way. There's a fascinating suggestion here, which is brought in the Koren Talmud, regarding the source of this melach stomit. It says maybe that this is what we have in the salt deposits next to the Dead Sea. Makes sense. The word melach stomit coming from storm, which is in that location. You've seen source number 2. There's a quote here from the Koren Talmud. It says the salt is probably magnesium chloride. If there's any chemists here today in the audience, which is found in extremely high concentrates in the Dead Sea, which is consistent with this name, as that was in the location of storm. Magnesium chloride can easily become intermingled with regular salt, which is extracted in great quantities along the shores of the Dead Sea. Since magnesium chloride is poisonous, there is a danger that its introduction into the eye by unwashed hands could lead to an eye infection. Okay, so perhaps that is what this melach stomit is. Very, very interesting suggestion. But what we see, so in their days, they had salt, they had normal salt, they had melach stomit, whatever it was intermingled, and there was a danger. You had to make sure that you wash your hands. Nowadays, we know we don't ever have this melach stomit. It's not a danger. So should this halacha still apply or not? Says Tosfot in Eruvin, now on the top of page 58, source number 3, Mayim Achronim. He says, Achshav lo na'agu b'mayim achronim. Nowadays, even though the Gemara says chovah, and even though we'll see the Shulchan Aruch was obviously written after Tosfot, but Shulchan Aruch says Mayim Achronim chovah, quoting the Gemara. Says Tosfot, there's no chovah, and this is not our practice. We don't have this melach stomit anymore. It's not something which is commonplace. Says Tosfot, there's another reason why. Right, in those days, they had a practice where they would dip their fingers in salt after eating. Maybe it was a way of cleaning, I'm not sure exactly. But that also is not the custom. So number one, we don't have the same salt that they had there. Number two, even if we do have it, we don't dip our hands in the salt, and therefore no concern. So according to Tosfot, we can end the share over here. There's no obligation. That is not the practice. And that's it. As we'll see later on, there are many poskim, there are great poskim nowadays, who say no requirement of Mayim Achronim at all, and that is based on Tos. However, there is another Gemara, source number 4. The Gemara over here in Brachot gives us a different explanation. Says the Gemara Brachot, Tana, V'it kadashtem elu mayim rishonim, v'item kadoshim elu mayim achronim, ki kadosh Hashem ani Hashem elokechem. So based on this pasuk, talking about V'tkadashtem v'item kedoshim ki ani Hashem Elokechem, talking about holiness and sanctity, how we sanctify ourselves regarding the meal. So the Gemara splits it up. It says V'tkadashtem refers to Mayim Rishonim. That's a hint to learn about that we have to wash our hands before the meal. V'item kedoshim, that refers to Mayim Achronim, i.e. washing our hands after the meal. So what you see from this Gemara is that this has nothing to do with melach stomit. This has nothing to do with danger. There's a concept in terms of nikiyut, in terms of kedusha, in terms of sanctifying oneself. What it's necessary to wash one's hands before the meal, necessary to wash one's hands after the meal. It's an extra level of holiness. Again, it's reminiscent of the Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. The Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash, we have a concept of kiddush yadayim b'raglayim, and they would go and they would wash their hands before they begin. The whole reason why, in fact, nowadays that we still wash our hands before we eat bread, volume 13, it's got all the halachot of netilat yadayim. We skipped that, but it's because of they got to do with the mikdash, got to do with the fact that the kohanim would have to wash their hands before eating truma, etc., and that's why we still do that. Yeah.
Why don't you wash your clothes if you do
Okay, so we're going to get to that. We're going to get to that a little bit later in the share. The question was what in terms of the geder, in terms of the how we wash. Does it have to be with the cost? Does it have to be done the same way as Ma'amar Shonim? How much water would there have to be? We'll get there as well. But so far, what we've seen, but it seems to imply that the reason why it's chovah versus mitzvah is that it's a greater obligation because of this element of sakana, because the element of danger, of melach stomit. That was the Gemara in Chulin. The Gemara here in Brachot does not use the language of chovah, but it just says it seems to equate Ma'amar Shonim with Ma'amar Achronim because both are a requirement related to kedusha, and therefore that has nothing to do with melach stomit. So Tosfot, for whatever reason, seems to ignore the Gemara in Brachot, or he rejects the Gemara in Brachot, says the main obligation we learn from the Gemara in Chulin, and that does not apply nowadays. Other Rishonim, however, as we'll see, have a different approach. Page 59. Page 59, we have the Rosh. Rosh in source number 5 says, V'teima. He says we have a difficulty. Right, based on this Gemara here in Brachot, it says it's learned out from the pasuk Vitem Kedoshim, that is the source of Ma'amar Achronim. So it's got to do with Kedusha, says the Rosh. But what about Gemara in Chulin? V'per kol basar mashma shehen chova mipnei sakana mishum melach stomit shemasamet ha'einayim, says the Rosh. You look at the Gemara in Chulin, it's got nothing to do with Kedusha, it's got nothing to do with the spirituality, it's got to do with the fact you touch your hands with the salt, it's going to be a danger to your eyes, and that's the reason why you wash Ma'amar Achronim. So he differentiates between the two. The Rosh says we still have an obligation, but here is the difference. He says, Yesh lomar, mishum Kedusha amru shehen mitzvah, umishum sakanat melach stomit osifu la'asota chova. In other words, there are two levels going on over here. In the same way that Ma'amar Shonim is a mitzvah, right? So too, he says Ma'amar Achronim would be a mitzvah for the same reason of Kedusha. What the Gemara in Chulin said is more than that. It's a chovah as well. It's a more stringent level. That is because of the sakana. That is what goes back to what we said before. Chamira sakanta me'esura. It may be similar to another case. Somebody was discussing with me last week the question about mixing meat and fish. Right? There's a lot of discussion in the poskim. Can one eat meat and fish together? So in terms of kashrut, right, fish, it's not like basar v'chalav, whereby there's a Torah prohibition, as we know, eating basar and chalav, meat and milk together. When it comes to meat and fish, however, says the Gemara, that if you eat meat and fish together, that is a sakana, that is a danger. One may get sarat if you were to eat meat and fish together. We know all about sarat. We learned about it on Shabbat. So there we go. If you eat meat and fish together. The Rambam, by the way, does not bring this halacha. It's brought in the Shulchan Aruch in terms of the things, there are certain things. The Gemara tells us about many things that we should avoid because of sakana, because of danger. So we can include Ma'amar Achronim with it as well. We can include eating meat and fish together. It also says, for example, leaving a raw, open, uncooked eggs or onions or garlic, that is also because of a sakana or ruach ra'ah, that one should not leave that overnight and then eat it the next day. And the question is always which of these things which are brought in the Gemara because of sakana, which would still apply today, which should we still be concerned about? If current medical knowledge seems to indicate that is not the case. Some of these things appear in the Shulchan Aruch, some do not. Some appear in the Rishonim, some do not. So in terms of meat and fish, the more or less most common practice, I won't say universal, but almost universal practice, that we avoid eating meat and fish together, we avoid cooking it together, we avoid eating it on the same plate, we change our cutlery or change our plate or wash it off, or going from one to the other. Many people have the minhag tabel achayim, right, between the fish and the meat. So as not to eat them together. As I said, the Rambam does not bring this halacha. According to the Rambam, you could eat meat and fish together. The Rambam was a doctor. He thought there was no sakana. He was not concerned about it. The Shulchan Aruch says yes, we should be concerned. Many people today are concerned about it. But so here comes the question, and you'll see how all this relates back to Ma'amar Achronim in a moment. The Chatam Sofer was asked the following question. We say, Kamira sakanta me'isur, right? That something which is a danger, we have to be more stringent about it than something which is an isur. So we know that when you have an isur, you have meat and milk, for example, which obviously you cannot mix. But we know the rules of batel b'shishim. If you have a tarovet, if you have a mixture of something inadvertently, you can't go and do this on purpose. You can't go do bitul isur katchila. That is a prohibition. But if we have the famous pot of chicken soup, which a drop of milk inadvertently splashes and falls into this pot of chicken soup. So long as you can't see it and you can't taste it, how do we know that you can't taste it? So in the days of the Gemara, they would go and they would ask a non-Jew to taste it and see it and figure out if it's there. Nowadays, we can't rely on this for various reasons. But Chazal tell us the ratio is 60 to 1, right? 60 to 1. So if you work out that there are 60 times of the chicken soup versus 60 times more than the milk, and you can't see the milk, you can't identify it. Obviously, if you can still see it inside, even if it's in more than 60 to 1, that's no good. The point of nullification means it's nullified. It's as if it's not there. But it's as if it's not there. It's batal, right? 60 to 1, you can eat it. It no longer has an issur. What about meat? So that's meat and milk. But what about meat and fish? If we say that it is a sakana, right, that it's a danger, so chamira sakanta meisura, that you have to be more stringent than the prohibition. So then we might say that even 60 to 1, it should not be nullified. So is the question. So was asked the Khatam Sofer. His answer is fascinating. He says, we cannot eat meat and fish together. Why? Because the Gemara said we can't, because the Shulchan Aruch said we can't, because that is the practice. So we keep that. We're not changing the halakha in that sense. However, to say that it is the geder, the din of sakana, say that it's a danger, we see, and our medical knowledge today tells us that there is no danger in terms of eating meat and fish together. Therefore, to say that we should be more stringent on it to the extent that even 60 to 1, it's not going to be nullified, that the din of the status of chamira sakanta meisora, he says, that doesn't apply to it. That level of danger would not apply. Nonetheless, so we don't have to be extra stringent, but we still keep the basic din because that's what the Shulchan Aruch says, and that's the minhag, and that's what we continue. So don't mix the meat and the fish together. If it was mixed and it was 60 to 1, it was batal. The same way that meat and milk is batal. We'd say that would be as well. So I think the Rosh over here says a similar sort of thing. He says when it comes to Mayim Achronim, we have two levels. We have the level of the mitzvah of Mayim Achronim, which is what the Gemara told us in Brachot. We have the level of chovah, that it's an absolute obligation because of the danger. He says nowadays there's no danger, but you still have the mitzvah. Okay, so those are the first two. So we have Tosfot on the one hand who said there's no danger today. You don't need to do Mayim Achronim. End the share over here. You have the Rosh who says there's no danger, but you still need to do it based on the Gemara in Brachot. And then we have many other Rishonim who again agree maybe with the Rosh or maybe go a bit further to say that it would still be necessary. The Rambam, source number 6, Rambam says, well, maybe the reason of the Gemara talking about this danger might still apply. We might have other salts which are similar, which are the same. Says the Rambam, source number 6. He says, anytime that you eat bread with salt, you need to wash mayim achronim. Shema yesh bo melach stomit, unless there is melach stomit or melach shetiv'o kemelach stomit, or there might be salt which is similar. V'yavir yadav aleinav yisamem. Mipnei zeh chayavin eto al yadayim b'sof kol seuda mipnei hamelach. Okay, so the Rambam is maybe a bit of an intermediate position here. The Tosfot said we don't have melach stomit, you don't have to wash. The Rosh said you have to wash even if you don't have melach stomit. Rambam says you have to wash because you might have melach stomit or something similar. If we therefore know that we don't have melach stomit or anything similar to melach stomit, according to the Rambam, do we still need to wash mayim achronim? Maybe not. Yeah.
The difference is, one of the differences is the Rambam says you eat the salt with the bread, in the meal. So you should wash your hands then, because during the meal, you be touching your eyes all the time. Why would you wait to the end of the meal? The other source says that you're dipping your fingers in salt during the meal.
Right. So again, he does say, he says you have to wash your hands at the end. Seemingly, according to the Rambam, the practice is the same, meaning the bread is dipped in salt, you're eating it, but if you're using that salt, you're going to be dipping your fingers in it at the end of the meal, and therefore that's what it would seem to be. The Rif, source number 7, he says, okay, the Rif over here, we won't go into it now, but the very, very interesting and very strange stories that are brought in the Gemara and Yoma in terms of what happened on a certain occasion when a person did not wash mayim achronim. So he says, the first time we've seen, really, forget about the salt, forget about the melach stomit. Mayim Achronim, once Chachamim said it, you have to do it, you have to go and you have to wash. So that's essentially the difference. We have Tosfot on the one hand, who says, no more Mayim Achronim, because we don't have Melach Stomim. We have Rambam who says, you've got to do Mayim Achronim, because you might have Melach Stomim. The Rosh says, not worried about Melach Stomim, but you still have to wash Mayim Achronim. The Rif says, even if you don't have any salt or anything, you still have to wash Mayim Achronim. So the really extreme machloket here. Tosfot on the one hand says, forget about it. Rif on the other hand says, don't forget about it. Rav Dessler actually has in a number of places, he discusses, he says, where we have, and this comes up in other contexts as well, where we have a halacha, which Chazal gave us the reason for. They said, you have to do this. Right here they told us, you have to wash Mayim Achronim because of Melach Stomit. Or I'll give you another example. When it comes to killing lice on Shabbat. The Gemara discusses about killing lice on Shabbat, and it says that we have the melacha of shchita, one of the 39 melachot. The derivative of that is not just slaughtering for food, but any type of netilat neshama. So killing an insect or killing an animal, killing anything on Shabbat, that is forbidden. Says the Gemara as a discussion, says that only applies to animals and insects and things which are parim or avim, which reproduce in the natural way. But something which reproduces via spontaneous generation, which is a concept which until a couple hundred years ago scientifically people thought exists, that would not be included, and that would not be included in the prohibition of killing on Shabbat. And therefore says the Gemara in Shabbat that to kill lice, since lice are, again, the way this is done is microscopic, and Chazal understood that it's spontaneous generation, and therefore they said the melacha of shechita does not apply to it. So a big debate over the last 500 years or so. When we know that the lice also reproduce via the natural means that any other insect or any other animal does, would it still be permitted or forbidden to kill them on Shabbat? Again, there are poskim who say yes, there are poskim who say no. But again, it's the same idea that the reason Chazal told us no longer applies. Does the halacha still apply? So if Dessler writes, he says that even if we find the reason no longer applies, that was just one reason that they gave us, but there may be other reasons, there may be other things, and therefore that is his approach. The halacha does not change. Seemingly would follow the same idea over here. So how do we pass him? On page 60, Shulchan Aruch in source number 8 tells us Mayim Achronim Chova. This is probably the most quoted siman in the Shulchan Aruch. Right? Mayim Achronim Chova. It's not the end of it, but he says there is an obligation. He then says Yesh she'ein noagim litol mayim achronim. There are those who do not have the practice to wash. Afilu noagim ken adam shu isnis ragil litol yadav achal suda. He says, even if your practice is not to wash mayim achronim, if you're a person who always has to have their hands clean and is uncomfortable with having dirty hands, so then you have to go out of respect. You would have to go and wash your hands before Birkat Hamazon. Again, going back a few hundred years, habits of hygiene and table manners and things were a little bit different to nowadays. Nowadays, the hands are much, much cleaner than they were in the days of the Shulchan Aruch. But nonetheless, that's what he says. So the Shulchan Aruch seems to imply, based on the Rif, the Rambam, that Mayim Achronim is required. The Rama, in source number 9, in fact, in the Darkei Moshe, he says, Miu HaMinhag Kedivrei HaTosfot. Says that in Ashkenaz, the practice was like the Tosfot, that there are that we don't have to wash Mayim Achronim. So generally, again, this is not necessarily a machloket Ashkenazim and Sfardim, but the Shulchan Aruch seems to be the more common study practice is that one does have to wash Mayim Achronim. The Rama says it is not required. Many follow that. The Mishnah Berurah brings, and nonetheless, even according to the Rama, there are many who do have the practice still to wash Mayim Achronim. He says here in source number 10, Af achshav she'ein matzoi melach stomit beinenu yesh lachush lamelach achal shetava kmota lamelach acher. Excuse me, shetiv'a kmota. We need to be concerned. That's quoting the Rambam, that there might be another type of salt. And then he says that maybe there are other reasons why this is necessary. That's a gra. This is so the Vilna Gaon says that Mayim Achronim would still be necessary. This is the Vilna Gaon we see in a number of places follows this approach. For example, I mentioned other things which happen because of sakana. where we don't seem to have that danger nowadays. Do we still follow them or not? Another din which is brought in the Gemara is when you have mashkim megulim, right? If you have water which is left exposed overnight with no, it's left uncovered. In the Gemara it says we cannot drink that the next day. Why? Because we're worried that a snake or a scorpion may have come and left some poison in it. This is a sakana. Again, this is a big machloket amongst the Rishonim and Achronim. Does the din still apply today? Hopefully, even if you were to leave some water uncovered on your table, if you have snakes and scorpions coming in and leaving their poison in it, you probably have bigger problems than just the water. But the Vilna Gaon, for example, it's brought in Maaseh Rav that the Vilna Gaon says even today it does not apply. But the reason does not apply, but we still need to be choshesh for this idea, for this concept of my megulim. So to here he says as well that one needs to wash my machronim. Yeah.
When you do see people doing my machronim, they're taking a few drops of water, and it's not like you're doing it like you're dying. You're talking a couple of drops of water. You're not solving anything. Okay, good. So we're going to get to that. We are going to get to that. What's clear is that again the requirement for my machronim does not seem to be, in terms of how much water and how it's done, does not seem to be the same as for my rishonim. But we're going to talk about that question of the drops of water. Is that sufficient or not? According to most poskim, that is not sufficient, and that's something people should be aware of. I'll just mention one more point in terms of this philosophical debate, in terms of again things where the reason no longer applies, and does the din apply or not? As we've seen, we've discussed Ma'im Achronim. We've seen it's a machloket in the Rishonim and the Achronim. We mentioned a few other examples. As I said at the beginning, how do we know when we say that the reason doesn't apply? Does the din still apply or not? So it's very hard to give hard and fast rules on this. Rav Weiss has a very interesting suggestion. He has a number of proofs for this. Again, even there are going to be certain exceptions to the rule. But he says that in Chazal we find two different languages in terms of these kind of concerns. He says you find what's called the Gzeira and you find what's called the Chashash. What's the difference? A Gzeira is when Chazal made a decree, don't do X because you might do Y. Right? So for example, don't take medicine on Shabbat for somebody who is healthy. Somebody who is sick and is as a prescription medication is allowed to continue and is required to continue taking that medication on Shabbat. But somebody who's healthy, has a very, very light headache or something, and can get along fine without it. So there's a halakha not to take for a healthy person or a mechush ba'alma, not to take medicine on Shabbat. Why? Gzerat shchekat samamanim. Say gzerat, you might come to start grounding the herbs to make your medicine, and tochen is one of the forbidden melachot of Shabbat. Or not to play musical instruments on Shabbat is a gzera. Why? Because they might break and you might come to fix your musical instruments. Right? Both of these, I mentioned both of these examples because both cases, both of these gzerot, it's very, very unlikely that anybody nowadays is going to go and start fixing the musical instrument, or is going to start going and grinding the herbs to make their own medicine on Shabbat. But nonetheless, we say that reason for the gzera does not apply anymore. But we say the gzera still applies. That's the general rule. On the other hand, he says, do you have what's called a chashash? Chashash is where there is a concern. There is a concern that something might happen. Not that I might do it, but the concern is don't do X because Y may have happened already. Don't drink my megulim because there may have been a snake or a scorpion that came and put its venom in it when you went there. Right? Don't. And so he says, is a general rule. And again, even to this there are exceptions. But he says generally where there is a gzeira, right? Don't do X because you might do Y. Once Chazal established that, then that stays, even though we say nowadays the social reality dictates that it's much less likely that you'll do Y, the gzera remains in place. Where there is a chashash, where it's based on something, based on a concern that happens, something in nature, something around, something that may happen. If we see that things have changed and times have changed, and that concern that no longer applies, so then there would be much more room to say that this prohibition no longer applies. Again, that is it works quite well. Again, with most of the cases, you can see he backs it up from a number of Rishonim and Achronim. But that is that. So again, in terms of my Achronim, what we've seen is that there's a big machloket. There are those who say it's required, those who say it's not required. We now understand why, and everybody should continue to follow whatever their minhag is in terms of that.
If your minhag is not to do Mayim Achronim, so you can leave the share now. But if your minhag is to, or you want to understand more, we'll continue with some of the dinim. So one idea which is quoted by the Poskim, page 63, and the Poskim are already puzzled by this, which is that in those circles where Mayim Achronim, where there is a minhag, generally speaking, we find that it's the men that wash Mayim Achronim and the women do not. And the Poskim are already puzzled as to why this is, because if you hold that Mayim Achronim is an obligation, it shouldn't be that there is a difference. The same is not by Mayim Rishonim. Look on page 63, from Sefer Halichat Bat Yisrael by Fuchs. He says, Natilat Yadayim v'Mayim Achronim chiyuv hashaveh lanashim ke'anashim. Says it should be exactly the same for men and women, and he quotes that in the name of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. One svara that's brought, if you turn over the page, and you see source number 14, the Shevet Halevi, this is Rav Wosner, he says, Le'inyan Mayim Achronim, ein evdel ben anashim lenashim mi'ikar adin. Right? He says, right, ikar adin, according to the strict halacha, there should be no difference. Achen le'apuskim, degam bezman hazeh shayach yuv Mayim Achronim, ve'aminhag she'ein nashim nodlot kol kach. And so according to those who do wash Mayim Achronim, and yet there is a practice that women do not wash, why is that? He says, Al pi Shulchan Aruch sham, בזמן הזה לא שייך כלל מים אחרונים ורק מחמירים לעצמם ונשים לא קיבלו עליהם. So he says all of this is seemingly according to the fact that if we start off with the fact that mayim achronim is not a strict obligation nowadays, those who have the practice, it's only a chumrah, and therefore the men accepted upon themselves the chumrah, the women did not, and that is his understanding. Rav Melamed over here in Pnei Halacha says again, maybe the reason why we do Mayim Achronim is because of Kabbalistic reasons, and women did not accept upon themselves again these Kabbalistic practices. Whatever it is, as I say, the poskim struggle to find a reason. If you truly hold that it is an obligation, it would seem to be an equal obligation for both. That seemingly we hold that it's not an obligation, only a chumrah, and therefore that is why men are particular about it and women are not. It's reminiscent a little bit of something we discussed before Pesach in terms of the halachot of leaning. You remember the halachot of Haseva, where we said the Raviyah, famous opinion in the Rishonim of the Raviyah, who says nowadays that we don't, we're not required to lean because that's not the way that we eat, that's not the way we express freedom and comfort and nobility. Nonetheless, we don't accept the opinion of the Raviyah when it comes to men, but we do accept the opinion of the Raviyah when it comes to women. Okay.
What do you mean from Machmir and Le'asma? What's needed to formalize Machmir and Le'asma? 10 people, 20 people, a community,
again, seemingly what you mean kiblu aleim, the common practice. Is
that possible today?
Is it possible today? Probably not. Meaning an individual can take on a chumrah for themselves or for their family. Yeah.
In other words, to break a chumrah.
To break a chumrah. How do you? So again, it depends. It depends on what kind of level we're talking about. There are different things. For example, we're talking about. there's a difference between minhag versus chumrah versus if we have a minhag like what his favorite minhag, kitniyot, right? On Pesach, he said it before me. Right? That is something that is completely a universal practice. That is that all Ashkenazi communities accepted. One Ashkenazi community, one shul is now going to come along and say, we don't want to keep a kitniyot anymore. It doesn't work that way. That is universal. Yom Tov Sheni Shel Galila. Right? The entire Jewish community accepted. I mention those two because those are the ones that we get asked about all the time. People are always unhappy about. Why do we have to keep Yom Tov Sheni? Why do we have to keep kitniyot? It's universal practice. There's no question. If a certain individual took on for himself a chumrah, a certain family took on a chumrah, and that's something there's more room to work with. Again, we have a principle. Your family, but there are circumstances whereby that could be undone, where you could do hatarat nedarim. You certainly cannot do hatarat nedarim for a minhag or a chumrah, which is accepted by the entire community or the entire Jewish people. Okay, let's talk a little bit about how the Mayim Achronim is done. And going back to Mark's question, let's skip to page 70. Page 70 talks about the proper procedure for Mayim Achronim, how much of the hand is required to be washed. So again, the Gemara does not really go into detail about this. It discusses regarding Maim Rishonim, how much, and the accepted halacha is that before a meal one should wash up to the wrist. But what about Maim Achronim? So source 29, which is Torah Tabayit of the Rashba. The Rashba says, he quotes the Ravid. It's a Ravid Zal Piresh. Ava Maim Achronim she'enan ela lechotz lichluch ha'ma'achal. Again, we understand from the whole point of Maim Achronim is just getting rid of the salt or getting rid of the dirt, whatever it may be on the tips of the fingertips. So therefore, he says, he says, therefore, it is enough to wash until the second knuckle of the fingertips. That is sufficient. Because that's up to that point where people eat, and beyond that, it's not as well. Again, it may be, by the way, we don't see it here explicitly, but the fact that eating related to what Tosfot said, the fact that eating habits have changed so much over the years. Back then, certainly in times of the Rishonim, even in times of the Shulchan Aruch, was commonplace. Everybody was eating with their hands throughout the meal. Nowadays, most people, it might be different, but many people do not eat with their hands. Many people are eating with knives and forks and cutlery, and our hands are not getting dirty. And that may be part of why this changed as well. But in any event, the Rashba says that it's enough to wash up to the second joint of the fingers, second knuckle. Kada Kemach of Rabbeinu Bachai, another one of the Rishonim, he says, "Maim achronim ein tzrichin ela pisat hayad b'mkom she'atzbot kalim." He says, so one needs to wash up to the palm, i.e. up to the end of the fingers, not up to the wrist, so a little bit more than the second joint of the knuckles, but up to the end of the fingertips. And says the Shulchan Aruch in source number 31, "Ein tzarich litor ela ad perek sheni shel etzbot." He paskins like the Rashba. But what we have not seen, but is anybody who says just take a few drops of water and that's enough. And the Mishnah Brura over here, this is one of those places where he gives a little bit of musa. Source number 32, the Mishnah Brura says, again, he explains the Shulchan Aruch based on the Rashba that it's only up to the second knuckle. That's where, generally speaking, the food reaches, where it gets dirty. It says, if you know you're eating a shawarma and you have sauce all over your hands, so then you need to wash the rest of your hands as well. And now he says in bold, he says there's something very bad which I've seen. I'm going to give a rebuke for this, just to prove of this practice. So there are those people who are careful about washing Maim Achronim. Again, if you don't wash Maim Achronim and you rely on that, that's fine. That's one opinion. But if you do hold that it's required, but they haven't fulfilled anything. They just put a few drops of water on the tips of their fingers. That has not achieved anything. He says, if you are going to wash Maim Achronim, it needs to be up to the joints. Okay, and then it says, what about drying the hands as well? So over the page, you see the Rambam, source number 33. He says, "Tzarech adam lenagev et yadav, v'achar kach yochal." A person needs to. So that's before eating. He says a person needs to dry their hands and then eat. V'kol ha'ochel v'lo niguv yadayim kochel lechem tameh. Again, the concept is, if all of the washing before bread, it's related to the laws of Tumah and Tahara, which do not apply anymore. But the idea was that food can only contract Tumah when it has been mukhshar, meaning when it has come into contact with liquid, contact with one of the 7 liquids, water being one of them. That's why if one would wash their hands to make sure they're tahor, but the hands are still wet, and then the food could still contract Tumah as well. Therefore, one needs to make sure they dry their hands before eating. Also, when washing Maim Achronim, then one needs to wash their hands and dry them before saying Birkat Hamazon. By the way, the Rambam has an interesting shita. Now we mention it regarding Maim Rishonim. When it comes to Maim Rishonim, when we wash our hands before a meal, we have a problem with the bracha, because generally speaking, we say whenever we make a bracha over a mitzvah, we say Mevarech over l'asiyatan, which means you say the bracha just before. We don't want to wait too long. We don't want there to be a hefsek. We don't want there to be a pause before, as close as we can before the mitzvah. So on Sukkot, for example, when we take the Arba Minim, we hold the lulav and etrog together. If we hold them together already, we fulfill the mitzvah. So we hold the etrog upside down. So that's not the proper way, but it's right there. We say the bracha and quickly turn it over, and then we do the ni'anah. Person puts on tefillin, you're holding the tefillin, the strap, just before you tighten it, you say the bracha, then you tighten it and you begin, etc. So when it comes to Netilat Yadayim, right, what happens is that says the Rambam, and this is the place of the Rambam, and there are some people who are knowing this way today. So says the Rambam, you say the bracha first, al Netilat Yadayim, and then you wash your hands. That is the Rambam. The general, the more common practice is that we wash our hands first and then say the bracha. We don't want there to be a hefsek between washing hands and eating the bread, between Netilat Yadayim and hamotzi. A lot of people get this wrong as well, and people think the idea of there not being a hefsek means there not being an interruption. It's not necessarily to do with speech. It's speech is one of the things that we know. We know makes an interruption, but sometimes you'll be at a Shabbos table or whatever. People go, they wash their hands and they're sitting down, and there are entire conversations, silent conversations that take place across the table. That one should not do that. That is probably a hefsek. In fact, it's probably better, right? If it's something that's for the sake of the meal, so one would be permitted to. The point is, you can't have a hefsek of something that's not for the sake of the meal, whether it's speech or not. Gemara says you need to say pass the salt. You could say pass the salt. That's not considered a hefsek. Again, most people don't do it. People are going to get confused. People are going to think you can say anything. But you should not have a hefsek. In any event, so often what most people do is they'll wash hands and then say the bracha before drying the hands, because the drying is still part of the mitzvah. Says the Rambam, and I've seen I've seen Talmidei Chachamim who are knowing this way as well. But says the Rambam, he says you fill up the cup of water, say the bracha, and then wash your hands. That's interesting. But otherwise, we can again, the more common practice is to wash, say the bracha, and then dry. But says the Rambam that drying the hands is included. That is part of the mitzvah, but whether it's Maim Rishonim or Maim Achronim. Other Rishonim, the Rashba, the Raavad, the Beit Yosef brings them here, say that one is not required to dry the hands for Maim Achronim, and says the Shulchan Aruch. He says, Yesh Omrim Maim Achronim einam tzrichim niguv, Rambam menagev v'achar kach mevarech. So there are those who say it's not required. The Rambam says that it is required. One more point in terms of the amount of water. So there is an opinion of the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, who says that actually the amount of water you need for Maim Achronim needs to be the same as Maim Rishonim, meaning you have to use at least a Ravit that the Mishnah Berurah brings. Right, you can see it over here in source number 36. He says, nonetheless, it's not. It doesn't seem to be required, but again, just a few drops of water. One needs to have enough to actually wash their hands up to the knuckles at least, if one is fulfilling the practice of Maim Achronim. One last point, just which the poskim discuss, is that after Maim Achronim is one allowed to talk or delay or speak or anything else before Birkat HaMazon. So says the Mishnah Berurah, source number 37. He says, "Sarich lezaher shelo lafsik ben hanetila leBirkat HaMazon afilu b'divrei Torah." There's not, once one has washed Maim Achronim, one should be careful not to speak at all, and should do Birkat HaMazon straight away. One point that comes out of this, we'll see this in Machlokes as well, but certainly all the poskim agree that if one washes Maim Achronim, that is a sign that one is making that one is finished eating. That is the end of the meal. Right? Same thing as singing Shir HaMaalah, for example, on Shabbat or whenever it is. So if one, the halacha is that when one decides that they've concluded their meal, and then they then change their mind, they would have to make a new bracha rishonah before eating. So you finished eating, you decided you finished, and then somebody brings you a piece of cake or whatever, or without getting into the machlokes whether you have to make a bracha of cake in the first place or not. But if you've decided that you're finished, so your bracha rishonah no longer applies, and then you decide you want to eat, you would have to say bracha. What determines whether one is finished or not? Again, it remains to be seen. How clear one is in one's mind that the meal is finished. But certain actions, we understand that is completely a hesech hadat. Maim Achronim is one of those. Once one has washed Maim Achronim, then it's clear. All of a sudden, you decide you want to eat again before Birkat HaMazon, you would be required to make a new bracha. The Aruch HaShulchan, source number 40, he's a little bit more lenient. He says that it's not strictly required that, if one needs to talk afterwards, we'll just read through the Aruch HaShulchan. He says, Katab Rambam b'sof perek shishi, Techef l'mayim achronim birkat hamazon. So the Rambam says right immediately after mayim achronim one should bench. V'lo yafsik b'neihem b'davar acher. Don't stop with anything else. Afilu lishtot mayim achar shnotel yadav v'achrona asur. Even to drink water or anything would be forbidden. Ad shevivarech birkat hamazon. So that is the language of the Rambam, and he says so too is the language of the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, and so says Rashi. Ad kan shana, going now 4 lines from the end, source number 40. It says Mikol makom mashma Mikol ze mashma derak lafsik b'achila v'shtiya asur. He says, but if you look carefully, that what in the language of the Rambam, the Shulchan Aruch, and the others, you see that eating or drinking after mayim achronim would be forbidden. Aval dibur lo haveh hefsek, but speech would not necessarily be a hefsek. So he says, therefore, at least b'di'evet, one could still talk a little bit after mayim achronim, but most of the poskim say, again, if it is your practice, there shouldn't be unnecessary delay. One should try not to speak at all, and one should wash, therefore, immediately before Birkat Hamazon. Okay, so Adkan. So those are some of the details. Again, for those who are noheg, for those who are not noheg, that is a lekatchila practice according to many poskim. And Rav Shechter, for example, does not hold that mayim achronim is required. But we've seen some of the halachot. And Adkan, next week we'll move on. After mayim achronim, we have Birkat Hamazon. So we'll deal with the halachot of Zimun. That will be next week.
Once practicing not to do mayim,
Yeah.
Is it the obligation of the host to make that available, or
So it's a good question. The question was, if one's practice is not, if one's practice is not to do mayim achronim, and one has guests whose practice is to do mayim achronim, is there an obligation to allow it? So I don't know that there's an obligation. The truth is that it may be, again, if let's reverse the question. If your practice is to do mayim achronim and you're in the home of somebody else who is not mayim achronim, so I think there's room to say that one go by the practice of the host and otherwise, yeah. It would be a good practice. It would be a good practice to offer it, to say anybody who wants a mayim achronim can go. But that's kind.